Jeffrey Epstein, and as we said on the show yesterday, this is the outrage actually is a bipartisan outrage. It's red state outrage and it's blue state outrage, with the question being, how in the world was this guy left alone in his cell? As the Attorney General said yesterday, it's shocking the number of procedures that weren't followed for a guy that had to be considered, right, like the most valuable prisoner in America.
And it becomes more jaw-dropping the more details we hear about how it happened. The Attorney General, as you mentioned, William Barr, calling a failure at the federal jail where sex offender Jeffrey Epstein was able to hang himself inside his cell. One official briefed on the case tells NBC News Epstein was not checked every 30 minutes as required, though it's unclear how long he went without being monitored. 3 prison officials with knowledge of the case told the New York Times that one of the 2 people guarding Epstein the night he took his life was not an official corrections officer. Yesterday, the Attorney General, technically the chief of federal prisons, addressed what he called irregularities at the federal jail and pledged a thorough investigation. Meanwhile, the case is now shifting from Epstein to anyone who may have helped him prey on young girls. Here is Attorney General Barr.
Let me assure you that this case will continue on against anyone who was complicit. Epstein. Any co-conspirators should not rest easy. The victims deserve justice, and they will get it.
Here's some of those details I was referring to. The New York Times reports that only one of the 2 people guarding the special housing unit where Epstein was housed normally worked as a correctional officer. While officials did not tell the paper what kind of job the other employee usually worked, the Times points to an investigation the paper published last year which, quote, detailed this practice under which federal prisons are so strapped for correctional officers that they regularly compel teachers, nurses, secretaries, and other support staff members to step in as correctional officers. The report in the Times continues, many of these staff members only receive a few weeks training in correctional work, and while required by contract to serve as substitutes, are often uncomfortable in the roles. Even workers who previously held correctional positions have said the practice was unsettling because fewer colleagues were on hand to provide backup if things turned ugly. All that from the New York Times. The paper also notes that the practice has grown at some prisons as the Trump administration has curtailed the hiring of correctional officers. Let's bring in NBC News investigations reporter Tom Winter, who's been on this story from the beginning. Tom, people hear these details, they can't believe their ears that this is happening in any prison, but in particular at the special housing unit, where, as Joe said, perhaps the most closely watched, high-profile inmate in the entire prison system is sitting.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Willie, when you look at these type of details and you get into this, and the reporting of my colleague Jonathan Deans is that the staffing that night was appropriate, but there are questions, and we know that it's being looked into whether or not, to your point about the Times reporting, whether or not that the people that were working that night were full-fledged correctional officers, and if not, what were their prior roles, and what were they doing there? As you said earlier, our reporting indicates that Jeffrey Epstein was not checked upon within 30 minutes, as is required by policy. So, you know, that's not 30 minutes, the top and bottom of every hour. They don't want the people that they're guarding to know exactly when they're coming around, but it should have been within 30 minutes. And it may have been several hours based on the reporting of Pete Williams that it would have been before he was checked on. So when you look at that and you think that it was perhaps several hours before anybody checked in on Epstein, that's more than enough time to do what apparently he did in this case.
And I understand, Tom, about the hiring freezes over the last couple of years. That's the union that covers correctional officers was outspoken about that yesterday, that they've raised these red flags for some time now. But that's not enough. I mean, it just doesn't add up that a person like, again, Jeffrey Epstein, who the eyes of the world are upon and who should be taken care of so that he can face his victims, so that he can face prosecution, is left completely unwatched for hours on end.
There are different inmates in the federal prison system. That's just the reality of it, Willie, to your point. And what doesn't make sense in this case is that you know that you have somebody who's tried to injure themselves before. And even if they're not on suicide watch, there's somebody that should probably checked in on. To your point, this is somebody who's very high profile, probably in terms of media coverage, the most high profile defendant in the entire judicial system that's awaiting a trial at this point, just as far as the headlines and the headlines that you're showing. So when we look at this, it's a clear failure that somebody didn't think to check in on him multiple times over the course of the night. Clearly, policy wasn't filed. And yes, to your point, look, there are definitely shorting and staffing challenges at all these federal prisons. Everybody there is having to work a tremendous amount of extra overtime, and the union is definitely upset about this. This is something that is new over the last several years, but still, to your point, it doesn't excuse what happened here Friday into Saturday morning.
All right, NBC's Tom Winter. Tom, thanks so much. Joe, the New York Times is reporting that one of the guards in the unit where Epstein died had been working overtime for 5 straight days. The other had been forced to work overtime that same day Epstein died. I get all that. I get the hiring freeze. But my God, it's Jeffrey Epstein. How do you take eyes off of him?
Yeah, it makes no sense at all. And Mike Barnicle, I know the Attorney General was criticizing the Bureau of Prisons and the way they handled this. At the same time, this is such a critical, a critical issue to keep this man alive, especially since he'd been on suicide watch before, especially since he was, we knew there was a complete miscarriage of justice before when a sweetheart plea deal was done. This is a guy who had escaped justice for years. And it is of paramount importance that his accusers had a chance to confront him in a trial and also confront other very rich and powerful people that were associated with Epstein who may have raped young girls.
Yeah.
So what was he? So you would think this would have gone to the top of the Attorney General's list to make sure that the Justice Department handled this correctly from top to bottom.
Joe, you're right, and the Attorney General's comments yesterday in New Orleans came off as a little too late, too little, and too predictable, actually. He's greatly upset at what happened. Well, he should have been greatly upset prior to this, and someone should have had knowledge prior to this of all of the other regimented, almost rules that have been avoided here. Jeffrey Epstein died without a cellmate present. That's a critical component in these security cells in this wing of the prison. Someone else ought to have been in that cell. We don't know how long he was without someone else sharing the cell. And, Gene, this whole thing just gives vent to those who want to come up with conspiracy theories and the fact that we're living in a rigged system.
Of course it does. There's a long history of conspiracy theories playing a role in our political life in this country. It goes way back, and so now again we have the theories. Now we have President Trump who retweeted a conspiracy theory about Epstein's death. We have William Barr who expressed his anger and outrage that this happened. We ought to reflect on the fact that Jeffrey Epstein was, at the time of his death, in the custody of Donald Trump and William Barr. He was in federal custody. And so it really is their ultimate responsibility and their ultimate failure. One thing this reminds me is that this is an administration that down the line just can't be bothered to fully staff the federal bureaucracy with competent people who can identify problems like those that we're starting to learn about at the Metropolitan Correction Center and do something about it. And that didn't happen here. I believe there's an acting director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I believe there's no number 2. It's just, and it's a tragic example of the kind of rot that we're seeing in a lot of places in the government.
We're going to be continue talking about this throughout the 3 hours. Julie Brown, the Miami Herald reporter who broke so much of the Epstein story that